Hello everyone. Today we are going to tell a story that originated in the streets of Palermo, from a simple but tragic event. The story of betrayal, in which ordinary Sicilians, driven by resentment of foreign rule, rose up together to take back their homeland. The Sicilian Vespers of 1282 was not a romantic street brawl, but a structural rupture in Mediterranean politics. After the papacy installed Charles I of Anjou over Sicily to crush the Hohenstaufen, Angevin rule shifted the kingdom's center of gravity to Naples, imported French officials, tightened fiscal extraction to fund wider ambitions, and eroded local customs, provoking broad resentment among urban elites and commoners alike. The immediate spark came on Easter Monday outside Palermo's Santo Spirito, when an altercation between armed Angevin personnel and locals during evening prayers escalated into targeted attacks on garrisons and tax agents, and within days the rising spread to Corleone, Trapani, Marsala, and especially Messina, where control of the straits made defense decisive. What began as a riot quickly took institutional form as councils rang bells, swore oaths, and framed their actions as the restoration of law and honor, while diplomacy connected the revolt to a credible royal protector, Peter III of Aragon, husband of Manfred's daughter Constance, whose dynastic claim, amplified by the networking of John of Procida and the anti-Angevin interests of Byzantium, turned Sicilian resistance into an internationally legible regime change when Peter landed at Trapani in August 1282. From there, the conflict widened into the War of the Sicilian Vespers, decided less by sieges than by sea power, as Admiral Roger of Lauria's Aragonese fleets shattered Angevin logistics, while papal attempts to reverse events, excommunication, and the failed Aragonese crusade, exposed the Curia's partisan limits. After 2 decades of attrition, the Peace of Caltabellotta formalized what reality had already produced: a durable split between the island kingdom under Frederick III of Sicily and the mainland kingdom of Naples under the Angevins, tied by marriage but functionally separate. The outcomes were profound. Angevin dreams of an Eastern Mediterranean empire faded. Aragon emerged as a central Mediterranean power. Italian geopolitics absorbed a lasting Naples-Sicily duality, and Sicilian institutions and identities recalibrated around autonomy within an Aragonese maritime network. Remembered through chronicles and later culture as a founding act of dignity, the Vespers endures as a case study in how fiscal overreach, administrative displacement, local legitimacy, naval dominance, and dynastic legality can combine to overturn great power designs and redraw the map. Charles of Anjou's accession marked a decisive break with the Hohenstaufen order in the Regno, the composite kingdom of Sicily that included the island and the southern Italian mainland, inaugurating a regime that was programmatic, expansionist, and relentlessly fiscal. And it is precisely those qualities that generated the tensions and ultimately the discontent that culminated in the Sicilian Vespers. Installed with papal blessing after Benevento and the elimination of the Hohenstaufen heir at Tagliacozzo, Charles imagined the realm not as a patrimony to be husbanded, but as the engine of a Mediterranean project. Fleets to dominate the Tyrrhenian, garrisons to guard the straits, cash to bankroll wars in the Balkans, and perhaps one day a march on Constantinople. Turning vision into policy, however, meant recoding the relationship between ruler and ruled. Under the Normans and Hohenstaufen, Sicilian institutions, crown, baronage, and urban communes had evolved a negotiated balance that left room for local privileges, multilingual administration, and flexible municipal statutes. Charles's government, by contrast, set about centralization. Chancery practice was regularized in the Angevin manner. French and Provençal officers replaced or overshadowed local office holders. The fiscal apparatus was tightened with new or expanded gabelles, notably on salt, customs dues, and the leasing out of tax farms to consortiums close to the court. What the crown called order felt like extraction to those who paid it. The island's cities, Palermo, Messina, Catania, saw their revenues tapped for naval construction and provisioning. Countryside communities experienced requisitions of grain and fodder, the billeting of troops, and the steady erosion of customary exemptions that had once softened royal demands. The nobility, often portrayed as a single block, was in fact heterogeneous. Remnants of Hohenstaufen loyalists, older Norman lineages, urban magnates whose wealth flowed through trade, and newer families whose fortunes rose with Angevin service. Charles exploited that diversity, rewarding adherents with confiscated fiefs, and pushing a stricter feudal hierarchy that bound great men more directly to the crown. Yet the same measures alienated many others. Confiscations and redistributions after 1266 to 68 bred long simmering litigation. Appeals to the royal courts increasingly favored newcomers who spoke the language of the chancery and understood its procedures. Barons who had once presided over local justice found themselves second-guessed by royal justiciars, while municipal councils saw their charters trimmed and their jurates bypassed by governors appointed from Naples. Even where Angevin rule brought competence, more predictable coinage, better archival record-keeping, regular musters, the political meaning was unmistakable. Sovereignty was flowing north across the straits to the new administrative heart in Naples. For Sicilians, that relocation symbolized colonial treatment. Resources were raised on the island, but decisions were taken on the mainland. The king rarely appeared in Palermo. Petitions traveled across water to be answered, if at all, by men who neither spoke the local dialects nor shared local concerns. Fiscal practice sharpened the edge of this alienation. Tax farming encouraged short-term maximization. Farm the salt monopoly, squeeze arrears, and pass the risk to the population. Customs officials watched harbors with a zeal that chafed merchants. Audits chased municipal treasurers for every uncollected tari. Grain purchases for the fleet left markets thin and prices volatile. The results were uneven but palpable. Craftsmen and sailors dependent on seasonal rhythms suddenly contended with royal priorities that ignored them. Urban poor experienced food scarcity spikes, while better-off families found traditional charitable cushions strained by higher imposts. Meanwhile, garrisons stationed to protect order multiplied the frictions of daily life. Lodging, disputes in taverns and markets, episodes of arrogance that, in a society of sharpened honor codes, registered as personal and collective insults. It is telling that sources remember not only taxes and statutes, but slights. An officer's presumption, a soldier's grab, a judge's condescension. Small abrasions that, multiplied, became an atmosphere. The church's position, crucial in a papally sponsored regime, was supportive at Rome but complicated in Sicily. Cathedral chapters and monastic houses had guarded their temporalities zealously under previous rulers. Angevin centralization touched ecclesiastical revenues indirectly through broader fiscal drag, and directly when disputes over jurisdiction arose. Some prelates cooperated closely with the crown. Others defended immunities that local society regarded as buffers against the state. Sermons and processions could legitimate taxation when harvests were good, but in lean years, clerical endorsement of royal policy looked like acquiescence to foreign control. The crown's ideological claim that papal authorization sanctified Angevin authority was persuasive in curial circles, less so in neighborhoods where the measure of legitimacy was justice felt and protection delivered.
None of this is to deny that Charles's government achieved things. The fleet built in the 1270s was real and formidable. Coastal watch and convoy protection mattered to trade. Royal courts brought a degree of procedural clarity. Coin and weights standards were enforced more strictly than under the fading Hohenstaufen. But in politics, benefits must be experienced as benefits. For a merchant whose cargo was delayed by customs zeal, for a vintner whose casks were requisitioned for naval stores, for a parish that suddenly hosted a company of soldiers, the calculus tilted negative. And for the elites who anchored urban and rural governance, the deeper grievance was structural. They had become implementers of decisions they did not shape, functionaries in a system that increasingly treated them as obstacles to be managed rather than partners to be consulted. The broader Mediterranean strategy compounded the domestic strain. Charles's gaze rarely rested on Sicilian fields. It fixed on the Adriatic, the Balkans, and beyond. The dream of a restored Latin dominion over Constantinople, nurtured since the 1204 Crusader conquest and the later Byzantine restoration in 1261, required a navy and treasure. Sicily, prosperous and strategically placed, was the obvious base. Yet the very logic of that grand design, project power outward, pull resources inward, meant chronic tension at home. In political economy terms, the center pursued an imperial preference, subordinating local welfare to external objectives. That is why actors far away from Palermo mattered so much. The Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII, alarmed by Angevin plans, Genoese networks eager to thwart the Angevins and outflank Pisan rivals, and, pivotally, the crown of Aragon, whose dynastic tie through Constance, Manfred's daughter, furnished a legal and emotional alternative for Sicilians who wanted a king, but not this king. Against this backdrop, the nobility's disaffection ripened. Angevin redistribution had created winners bound to the crown. Yet even these allies felt constrained by the intensity of central oversight and the costs of continuous war footing. Losers, dispossessed families, sidelined magistrates, found common cause with urban leaders impatient with customs harassment, and with guilds squeezed by rising prices and irregular provisioning. Sicily's social fabric, long a mosaic of Latin, Greek, and Arabic traditions, had accommodated diversity under the Normans and Hohenstaufen, because those regimes left space for local forms. The Angevin style, culturally French and administratively uniform, felt like a negation of that negotiated pluralism. It is a cliché to say that identity politics mattered. In this case, it did, but as a byproduct of governance choice. When a French-speaking judge renders a decision that contradicts customary expectations, it reads as foreignness. When French garrisons enforce billeting, it reads as occupation.
Grievance became marked as ethnic because power was experienced as exogenous. Urban politics tightened the screw. Palermo's commune had long exercised real authority. Messina's position on the straits gave it leverage over mainland flows. Both saw their leverage clipped by governors with mandates from Naples. Municipal finances absorbed royal demands. Civic militias found themselves subordinated to commanders who did not share their loyalties. And the ritual life of the city, public proclamations, feast day processions, was repeatedly pressed into service of taxes and recruitment. Such instruments can integrate a polity when they are co-owned. They irritate when they are commandeered. In the late 1270s, as war expenditures rose and rumors of new expeditions proliferated, municipal patience thinned. The language of complaint, preserved in petitions and later chronicles, shifted from the conditional, "Grant us relief and we will comply," to the absolute, "This order violates our laws." The final years before 1282 thus look, from a distance, like a convergence of lines, rising fiscal saturation, increasing administrative displacement, and a strategic agenda that treated Sicily as staging ground rather than polity. Add the microphysics of daily insult, especially around soldiers quartered in towns, and the scene resembles kindling laid carefully, if unintentionally, for a fire. When that fire came, Easter Monday at Vespers outside Santo Spirito, it was not a cause but a trigger. A single altercation, remembered in sources as the harassment of a local woman and the retaliatory blow by her companions, would have been containable in another regime. In Angevin's Sicily, exhales sharply. It detonated accumulated resentment. The form the explosion took, selective attacks on garrisons, tax agents, and the most visible French functionaries, the immediate ringing of bells to summon councils, the swift reassertion of communal authority, betrays preparation in the broad sense, not a conspiratorial map posted in a cellar, but a shared repertoire of political response honed by decades of communal practice and sharpened by recent slights. This is where the nobility's earlier alienation mattered. Revolts of the poor burn hot and fast. Revolts that draw in town councils and segments of the baronage acquire organization. As Palermo turned, other towns followed, not because they aped a riot, but because they recognized a constitutional moment, an opportunity to recenter law and custom against a crown that had decentered both. Messina's choice to resist Angevin forces at the Straits made the movement strategic, not episodic. The defensive war that ensued could hold only if ports supplied men and grain, and if the countryside refused the invader food and guides. That happened because elites and commoners had already realigned under the pressure of Charles's centralization. To say that Charles's reign began a new era is to acknowledge his organizational talents and geopolitical imagination. To add but one fraught with tension and discontent is to register the cost of pursuing those ambitions through instruments that alienated every tier of Sicilian society. Heavy taxation and harsh measures were not incidental flaws. They were the operating system of a regime bent on external projection and internal uniformity. The local nobility's discontent was likewise no mere wounded pride. It reflected the structural displacement of a political class accustomed to bargaining with kings, and suddenly reduced to carrying out orders written elsewhere. If we follow these threads through to 1282, the outbreak of the Vespers appears less as a medieval accident than as a predictable outcome of state building that outran consent. Charles forged a fiscally capable and militarily credible monarchy centered in Naples. He also forged, by the same means, a Sicilian coalition capable of rejecting it. The lesson, hard then, durable since, is that regimes can buy fleets with taxes and hire officers from abroad, but they cannot purchase the legitimacy that comes from treating a realm as a community rather than a resource. In Sicily, the bill for ignoring that difference fell due at Vespers. Charles of Anjou's regime did not simply conquer Sicily. It installed an entire apparatus of foreign authority that many islanders experienced as intrusive, extractive, and disdainful. The appointment of French and Provençal officials to key fiscal, judicial, and military posts reshaped everyday life from Palermo's piazzas to the smallest inland communes. Language, law, and tone all shifted. Petitions traveled to a chancery that operated in the Angevin idiom. Rulings were delivered by men who neither spoke local dialects nor shared local custom. Garrisons quartered in towns patrolled markets, policed taverns, and asserted prerogatives with an air of entitlement. Each piece of that apparatus could be defended as modern government. Standardization of coin and measure, uniform procedures, regular musters, disciplined taxation. But governance is judged not by theory, but by experience. What islanders felt, in courtrooms and customs houses, at wharves and wells, was displacement. Authority seemed to have moved from their neighborhoods to Naples. Justice seemed to have been translated from familiar practice into a foreign script. The soldiers embodied the change most visibly. Billeting requirements pressed towns to house and feed companies whose presence strained resources and inflamed tempers. In a society where honor and public reputation carried immense weight, small confrontations, queue jumping at a bakery, rough handling at a checkpoint, off-color remarks in a marketplace, signaled to locals that the men with swords did not consider themselves guests. The mere fact of being uniformed strangers, backed by a distant sovereign, transformed ordinary frictions into political statements. Complaints that might once have been handled by a local notary or mediated by a parish priest now collided with the impunity of a garrison. Stories circulated, some accurate, some embellished, about arrogance and cruelty. A tax farmer who seized a widow's grain, a captain who demanded a merchant's best cask for the king, a sergeant who mocked a townsman's accent. Each anecdote added to a shared ledger of grievance. That ledger grew thicker because Angevin administration often pressed against the grain of custom. Under the Normans and Hohenstaufen, Sicily's legal and social ecology had been a mosaic. Latin, Greek, and Arabic traditions coexisted within a royal framework that, though hardly gentle, made space for municipal statutes, religious endowments, and local courts. By contrast,
Angevin centralization tightened fiscal screws. Salt monopolies, customs dues, farmed taxes. Standardized procedures that weakened municipal autonomy and reallocated fiefs to newcomers who spoke the language of the new chancery. What royal lawyers applauded as the victory of order over patchwork, Sicilians experienced as the erasure of negotiated balances that had kept the peace. When a French-speaking judge overturned a communal practice on the grounds that it lacked royal warrant, it was not simply a technical ruling. It was a public performance of foreignness. Economics magnified the insult. To finance fleets and continental wars, the crown needed cash and ships. That meant aggressive revenue collection and requisitions. In good harvests, higher taxes bite. In middling harvests, they wound. In lean years, they destabilize. Towns found their communal coffers raided to outfit convoys. Merchants saw cargoes delayed by customs zeal. Fishermen discovered new fees on privileges that had once been customary. Tax farming, leasing collection rights to private syndicates, aligned incentives toward short-term extraction. The crown received guaranteed sums. Tax farmers squeezed to recover their bids and profit. Predictably, that logic fell heaviest on those least able to resist. Smallholders, artisans, and petty traders who lived close to subsistence. When prices rose because grain stocks were diverted to the navy or to mainland garrisons, food insecurity turned resentment into anger. The public face of that anger was not a ledger or a schedule of dues. It was the collector at the door and the soldier on the street.
The local nobility, often caricatured as uniformly seditious, was in fact divided. Some families prospered by aligning with the new order. Others lost lands in the redistribution that followed Benevento and Tagliacozzo. Yet across factions, a common irritation grew. The jurisdictional encroachment of royal justiciars and the eclipse of baronial and communal courts. Nobles accustomed to bargaining with kings now found themselves subject to files and forms routed through Naples. Urban magistrates who had once interpreted statutes for their own communities were reduced to executors of orders drafted elsewhere. Even beneficiaries of Angevin favor bristled at intrusive audits and the endless summons to supply men and money for campaigns envisioned across the sea. The message radiating from Naples was unmistakable. Sicily was a base, not a partner, a resource, not a polity. That message clashed with identity as much as with interest. Sicily's urban and rural worlds prided themselves on local law, parish ritual, guild solidarities, and the memory, idealized but potent, of prior rulers who had, at minimum, performed respect for local forms. Angevin functionaries, whether through haste, cultural blind spots, or genuine disdain, often failed that performance. They mangled place names, ignored the symbolic weight of feast days, dismissed notarial formulas as archaisms, and prioritized royal writ over community compacts. In a tight-knit society, those slights were read not as bureaucratic accidents, but as a program of marginalization. The resulting sense of disenfranchisement did not require pamphlets to spread. It traveled by sermon and story, by market gossip and guild meetings, by family letters carried along the island's coasts. Foreign officials and soldiers thus served as lightning rods for discontent, whose deeper causes were structural. The Angevin project, to harness Sicily for Mediterranean strategy, to finance fleets for the Adriatic, and the dream of a Latin return to Constantinople, demanded centralization, cash, and compliance. But consent cannot be decreed. It must be sustained by benefits felt and by forms respected. In the 1270s, the benefits were too abstract, a distant fleet, an imperial vision, and the forms too often trampled. The papal imprimatur that had crowned Charles's rule counted for little where the currency of legitimacy was justice delivered locally and honor upheld publicly. As the decade wore on, micro-conflicts multiplied. A customs inspection that confiscated a merchant's goods without redress. A town council overruled on its election procedures. A monastery fined for asserting exemption. A quarrel between a soldier and a craftsman that the garrison commander refused to adjudicate fairly. Each incident might have been contained in a regime that offered accessible appeal or ritualized reconciliation. In the Angevin system, appeal followed long routes to distant desks. Reconciliation lacked the shared idiom it needed to convince. Consequently, resentment thickened into a habit, and what had been a list of grievances became an identity claim. Annoyed, "We are Sicilians. They are outsiders who wield power over us." Against this backdrop, the economy's cyclical shocks became political accelerants. A poor harvest or a spike in transport costs, common in a maritime economy, now landed on communities already carrying new imposts. Municipal charities and confraternities, traditional buffers in hardship, were stretched by rising demands and shrinking tithes. When price volatility hit staples, the crowd looked not to the weather but to policy, not to bad luck, but to bad government. In such climates, the moral evaluation of rulers hardens quickly. The administration is not merely inefficient, it is unjust. Its agents are not merely strict, they are arrogant. Its soldiers are not guardians, they are oppressors. The Church's role in this drama was ambivalent. Rome's sponsorship of the Angevins gave the crown a sacral gloss. Local clergy, however, were embedded in communities that bore the fiscal and social costs. Many prelates cooperated. Others defended immunities that islanders valued as shields against overreach. When pulpits justified exactions in the language of obedience and crusading necessity, congregations sometimes complied. But they also noted who spoke and who paid. The measured support of certain churchmen lent the regime legal cover. The silences and side glances of others offered the people psychological permission to doubt. In such a setting, the behavior of individual officials acquired outsized importance. A courteous governor could slow the erosion of trust. A venal tax farmer could destroy it in a week. Angevin policy, by relying on outsiders over locals, magnified the risk that the worst representatives would define the whole in public memory. The island's oral culture, rich in proverb and anecdote, stored those memories efficiently. When a French officer mocked a Palermo practice, or when Provençal soldiers swaggered in a Messina tavern, The story circulated from harbor to hillside. It interlaced with older tales of confiscated fiefs and cancelled charters, producing a narrative in which the foreignness of rule was both cause and proof of injustice. Meanwhile, the aristocracy's calculus shifted. Even those who had gained under Angevin redistributions saw the costs of standing alone with a crown that would not bargain. Litigation over fiefs dragged. Cash calls intensified. And the lack of local voice in strategic decisions grew harder to defend in front of one's own clients and tenants. The urban patriciate, merchants and notables whose fortunes depended on predictable port regimes and trust with neighbors, felt squeezed between royal demands and popular anger. The conditions for a cross-class coalition thus emerged. Nobles who wanted leverage restored, magistrates who wanted charters honored, guilds that wanted prices stabilized, and commoners who wanted soldiers curbed and collectors constrained.
It is in this convergence that the volatile environment matured into something more than irritation.
Sicily was no stranger to conflict. What made the late 1270s dangerous was the alignment of interests and perceptions. The foreignness of officials and soldiers provided the symbol. Economic hardship supplied the fuel. Disregard for custom struck the flint. Rumors of new taxes, of mass levies for overseas war, of insults at religious feasts, skittered along the same coastal routes that carried salt and wheat. Messina, guarding the straits, listened for word from Palermo. Corleone and interior towns watched the roads for troop movements. The island's geography, far from isolating communities, stitched them together by sea and ridge path into a listening network. In the final months before Easter 1282, the threshold between latent and manifest resistance grew thin. Municipal councils rehearsed legal formulas to defend self-help as defense of law. Confraternities honed rituals that could rapidly mobilize crowds with bells and banners. Neighborhood leaders weighed the risks of action against the risks of waiting. None of this required a single mastermind. It required only a common diagnosis. The regime was foreign in personnel, hostile to custom, excessive in taxation, and careless in social tone. In that diagnosis, soldiers at checkpoints and officials at desks stood in for the distant king. They were the faces islanders could confront.
Thus, by the time one incident at Vespers in Palermo turned from insult to violence, the stage was fully set. The imposition of French officials and soldiers had created an us-them boundary in daily life. Disregard for custom had delegitimized the moral claims of governance. Tax-driven hardship had hollowed the patience of communes and households alike. The Angevin administration's perceived arrogance and cruelty, whether in fact, tone, or rumor, made symbolism easy. To strike the garrison was to strike the regime. And when bells rang, they did not summon a riot without purpose. They summoned a coalition with memory, method, and aims. To reassert local law, to restore civic dignity, and to replace a foreign apparatus with a sovereignty that acknowledged Sicilian society as more than a quarry for imperial design. In retrospect, this prelude to the Sicilian Vespers demonstrates a classic pattern in pre-modern statecraft. Centralizing monarchies often mistake compliance for consent.
efficiency for legitimacy, and capacity for community. Charles of Anjou's government could count ships, coin, and captains. It could not count loyalties frayed by daily humiliations and customs judged disposable. The island's revolt did not arise from a vacuum of order, but from a surfeit of the wrong kind. Order that spoke the wrong language, ignored the wrong rules, and burdened the wrong people at the wrong time. The French face of that order turned structural choices into personal affronts, and turned policy into oppression. In that transformation lay the fuse. When it burned to the powder on Easter Monday, the explosion shocked the Angevin world. But it should not surprise us. Sicily had been told, by officials and soldiers alike, what it was in the new order. In 1282, it answered. The immediate spark for the Sicilian Vespers was a tragic, ambiguous, and, in the strictest sense, ordinary altercation that occurred at an extraordinary moment. Easter Monday, 30 March 1282. During evening prayers at the Church of the Holy Spirit, Santo Spirito, outside Palermo, contemporary and near-contemporary chroniclers, most notably Bartolomeo of Neocastro and Saba Malaspina, agree on the essentials even as they differ in color and emphasis. A detachment of Angevin, French Provençal soldiers mixed among the worshippers. A confrontation with local Sicilians. An affront involving a woman, variously described as harassment, searching, or a lewd gesture, met by a protective response from her companion or the surrounding crowd. Steel drawn, blood spilled. Whether the initiating act was a misunderstanding inflamed by drink and swagger, an abuse of authority under the pretext of a weapons frisk, or a deliberate insult will never be resolved with documentary certainty. What matters for history is that, at that precise juncture, the social meaning of the incident outran the facts. In a society already saturated with grievance over taxes, billeting, jurisdiction, and the visible foreignness of authority, this clash made the private body of a woman stand in for the public body of Sicily. A blow struck in her defense became, in an instant, a blow struck in defense of the community's honor. Once that moral translation occurred, events accelerated with startling speed. Bells rang, word leapt from the churchyard into the city. Knots of men coalesced around the most obvious targets of anger and legitimacy: the garrison posts, customs houses, and the dwellings of officials associated with Angevin rule. Palermo did not dissolve into random looting, it selected. That selectivity is crucial. The first victims were soldiers and state functionaries. The first objectives were arms and documents. The first public acts were oath-taking and summons by bell. In the language of medieval politics, those gestures attempted to convert a penalizable riot into a defensible restoration. We act not to destroy order, but to restore a just one subverted by foreigners. Chroniclers emphasize the crowd's use of shibboleths, tests of pronunciation, or quick questions in the local tongue, to distinguish French, a political category denoting Angevin personnel and affiliates, from other outsiders. That practice, however ugly, shows that the uprising was not a blind pogrom against all non-Sicilians. but a focused attack on the operators of the regime that islanders perceived as oppressive.
If the people supplied numbers and momentum, the nobility supplied reach and resources. That does not mean barons engineered the initial riot. The ambiguity of the Palermo spark argues against a scripted putsch. But by spring 1282, many aristocratic houses, diminished by Angevin confiscations, irritated by Neapolitan oversight, and sensitive to the temper of their tenants and clients, were ready to ride the wave. Some threw in early, offering fortified sites, horses, and retainers. Others waited to see whether Palermo's stroke would draw a crushing royal response. Once it became clear that the city had sealed itself and that nearby communes were following suit, noble participation widened. This broadened the revolt's social base into the kind of cross-class coalition that medieval monarchy found hardest to defeat. Urban elites and guilds for finance and manpower, barons for cavalry and castles, parishes for moral cover, sailors for control of the harbor, peasants for local intelligence and provisioning. The first week after Easter Monday was decisive in setting the uprising's character. Palermo's leaders moved to make law visible. They restored communal officers, demanded oaths of mutual protection, and publicly renounced obedience to the most detested royal agents. Confessionally, they framed the breach as a defense of honor, occurring at a sacred time, Vespers, against men who had violated not only custom, but the peace of the feast. This moral grammar mattered. It allowed clergy sympathetic to the community to bless, or at least not condemn, the movement, even as papal authority in Rome remained, at least initially, aligned with the Angevin crown. Juridically, the cities insisted they were not rebels, but guardians of their laws, while they sought a legitimate sovereign. A claim that would find traction when Peter III of Aragon appeared in the summer with a dynastic right through his wife Constance, daughter of the fallen Hohenstaufen Manfred. A key theatre in the early spread was Messina, gatekeeper to the Straits. If Messina fell quickly back under Angevin control, the revolt could be isolated on the western half of the island. If Messina held, the mainland army would face a defended crossing and a hostile shore. Messina held. Its citizens, alerted by Palermo's couriers and their own resentments, manned walls and organized supply. Women ferried water and stones to the ramparts. Artisans rigged chains across harbor approaches. Sailors turned everyday seamanship into literal warfare. Angevin forces probing from Calabria found that what had once been routine troop movements across friendly straits now required siegecraft and naval coordination, commodities that take time. That time allowed the revolt to institutionalize. Councils standardized watch bills, rationing, and mustering. Towns issued safe conducts. Letters crisscrossed the island, calling for common cause and mutual aid. The role of rumor in the Palermo spark deserves emphasis, not because it falsifies the event, but because it helps explain the pace. People did not wait for a notarial deposition before moving. The story that a French soldier had violated a woman at Vespers did not need precision to be credible. It fit pre-existing expectations about garrison arrogance and foreign contempt. In modern terms, the rumor had high prior plausibility. That is why so many chroniclers, despite their differences, mark the women's honor motif. It condensed grievances about jurisdiction, taxes, and billeting into a single image that any neighborhood could grasp.
Nor was the crowd only male. Sources allude to women's participation, not merely as victims whose violation demanded vengeance, but as mobilizers who carried news, urged husbands and sons to the gates, and in some cases taunted soldiers from the walls. Palermo's confraternities, lay religious brotherhoods, amplified the message through their processional networks, turning the bells and banners of devotion into tools of rapid communication. Historiographically, scholars have long debated whether the Vespers was spontaneous or orchestrated. The Palermo incident looks spontaneous. The subsequent diplomatic knitting with Aragon, helped by figures like John of Procida, looks orchestrated. The best reading is both. Social tinder accumulated over years. A spark fell by accident or petty malice. Political entrepreneurs then worked at speed to bind the local explosion to a legitimate alternative to Angevin sovereignty. The inner logic of the first 48 hours remains local. Parishes, streets, gates, markets. But within weeks, the revolt spoke the language of claim and right. Sicily did not say, "No king." It said, "Not this king, not these officials, not these exactions." That formulation would prove invaluable when Peter III landed at Trapani, August 1282, and was acclaimed. The people could present their rising not as an anarchic rejection of monarchy, but as a transfer of allegiance to a ruler who respected local law. The nobility's contribution to this transformation is easier to trace than to quantify. Some barons, dispossessed under Angevin redistributions, saw in the revolt a chance to recover lands. Others, even those who had prospered, recognized that uncompromising centralization from Naples left them little room to bargain. Their participation provided cavalry, retainers, and stone strongholds that popular movements typically lack. More importantly, nobles could mediate outward, opening channels to Genoese allies at sea, or to Aragonese emissaries interested in leveraging the crisis. They also mediated inward, persuading hesitant towns or rural districts that the rising was no mere riot, but the reconstitution of an older, more balanced order. That is why the movement's rhetoric so often invoked restoration, the return of customary rights, the revival of municipal statutes, the purification of corrupted offices, rather than innovation. Restoration tales convert fear into courage. They promise a familiar future. The Angevin reaction in the immediate aftermath was heavy but stretched. Charles I could ship troops from the mainland, but without secure harbors and friendly provisioning, he could not sustain sieges. Each landing required negotiation with terrain and people now committed to resistance. The harshness of the initial Palermo purge, events that later memory would remember as a massacre of French, hardened attitudes on both sides. For the Sicilians, it removed the human infrastructure by which the regime had governed. For the crown, it rendered reconciliation politically costly. Yet those same first hours also disciplined the rising. With the most visible agents of foreign rule gone, the need to rebuild administration under communal officers and trusted judges became urgent. In city after city, that is exactly what happened. By the second week, Palermo was not merely in rebellion. It was governing, apportioning grain, organizing patrols, issuing writs. Messina and other ports followed suit. News of the uprising's successes and of the initial failure of royal troops to retake key positions encouraged the hesitant. At the same time, local leaders understood that island strength could not match royal persistence indefinitely. That strategic reality pushed the nobility and communal elites to intensify contacts with Aragon. When Peter III arrived months later under the canopy of a dynastic claim, he stepped into a space prepared by the first hours and days after Vespers. A space where foreign power had been expelled, institutions had been reasserted, and the population had been unified around the proposition that Sicily's laws and honor were theirs to defend. Seen in this light, the Easter Monday incident is not a footnote to the Vespers. It is its hinge. The ambiguity of the act, insult or search, rumor or eyewitness, matters less than the social circuitry it activated. In a context of pent-up anger and resentment toward the French occupiers, the crowd did not simply vent. It reframed authority and reallocated it to itself, at least long enough to repel garrisons and invite a new sovereign. The nobility, resentful over lost autonomy and affronted by centralization, did not manufacture the spark. It recognized in the flames an opportunity to forge a coalition. The result was not chaos for its own sake, but a spontaneous yet structured insurrection, whose first day, from a woman's dishonor to a city's mobilization, set the trajectory of a decade-long transformation. From riot to revolution, from local defense to international war, from Angevin Sicily to a polity that, by 1302, would be acknowledged as separate under an Aragonese king. If one seeks the anatomy of how a single clash can unfasten an empire's local grip, Palermo at Vespers provides the case. Grievance crystallized in an instant. Institutions snapped to attention. Elites aligned with neighborhoods. The streets chose. And history turned. The Sicilian Vespers did not erupt in a vacuum. It was the outcome of decisions made by identifiable leaders: kings, ministers, admirals, magnates, clerics, whose aims and methods collided on an island that had long functioned as a hinge between Latin, Greek, and Islamic worlds. At the center of the Angevin side stood Charles I of Anjou, brother of King Louis IX of France, whom the papacy had invited to wrest the Regno, the composite kingdom of Sicily, encompassing the island and the southern Italian mainland, from the Hohenstaufen. Charles's victories at Benevento, 1266, over Manfred, and at Tagliacozzo over Conradin, yielded him a crown, but also a governing problem of his own making. He conceived Sicily as the fiscal and naval base for a far-reaching Mediterranean strategy, projection into the Balkans, leverage in the Aegean, and even the dream of a restored Latin dominion at Constantinople. And he built the machinery to pursue it, a French/Provençal administrative cadre transplanted to key posts, a tightened fiscal net of gabelles, customs, and tax farms, a standing naval program centered increasingly on the mainland capital at Naples. That machinery accomplished some of what it set out to do: regularized chancery practice, paid for fleets, and held strategic fortresses. But it did so at the cost of alienating nearly every stratum of Sicilian society. For towns used to negotiating their statutes under the Normans and Hohenstaufen, Charles's governance looked like centralization without consultation. For barons, it looked like confiscation and surveillance. For artisans and smallholders, it meant higher imposts, billeted soldiers, and an everyday sense that law now spoke a foreign tongue. Charles's relationship with the papacy was a study in mutual use and mutual anxiety. Popes Clement IV and his successors had backed the Angevin enterprise to eliminate Hohenstaufen power from Italy and safeguard papal temporal interests. Yet even as pontiffs legitimized Charles's rule, they worried, sometimes openly, about the scale of his forces and the open-endedness of his ambitions. A king who could move armies at will across central Italy and arm fleets in Neapolitan harbors was a useful counter to imperial revival, but he was also a potential constraint on papal freedom of maneuver. That tension helps explain later curial vacillations and the eventual resort to extreme measures, excommunications, and even a crusade label against Aragon, when the Vespers had upended papal calculations. In the 1270s, however, the papal seal enhanced Angevin legitimacy in the abstract. It could not repair the daily abrasions caused by tax farmers, garrisons, and governors who seemed to treat Sicily as a revenue basin rather than as a polity. If Charles embodied the provocation side of the story, the catalytic figure on the insurgent side is often named as John of Procida, a physician, courtier, and diplomat whose career spanned the Hohenstaufen, Sicilian, and Aragonese orbits. Here the sources turn slippery. Later narratives present Procida as the grand orchestrator who, embittered by losses under Angevin rule and personal injuries inflicted by French agents, wove an anti-Angevin coalition linking the Crown of Aragon, Sicilian exiles, and even Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, who feared Charles's eastward designs. Some accounts include lurid details: assaults on Procida's family, murder of a son, that are difficult to corroborate and read like the retrospective moralization typical of medieval political storytelling. What is well supported is that Procida acted as a go-between. He traveled extensively. He had the linguistic and cultural tools to move among Italian communes, southern baronial courts, and Iberian palaces. And he appears in diplomatic correspondence at precisely the moments when Aragonese interest in Sicily was hardening from sympathy into strategy. Whether he planned the Palermo riot of Easter Monday 1282 is doubtful. Whether he leveraged the riot instantly as proof that a receptive populace stood ready to transfer allegiance is far more plausible. In that sense, Procida is significant less as a secret puppeteer than as a political entrepreneur who aligned a spontaneously ignited revolt with a royal protector capable of sustaining it. That protector was Peter III of Aragon, a ruler with the temperament and resources to convert Sicilian insurrection into a recognized regime. Peter's position combined opportunity and legitimacy. The opportunity lay in Aragon's maritime evolution. The crown had grown into a composite power with assets in Catalonia and Valencia, and a merchant marine accustomed to long Mediterranean routes. It had admirals and captains ready to contest sea lanes. The legitimacy came through Peter's marriage to Constance, daughter of Manfred and granddaughter of Frederick II, which furnished a Hohenstaufen claim to the Sicilian throne. Historians have sometimes understated how important such claims were in medieval political grammar. Sicilians, like most Latin Christians of the age, did not imagine replacing monarchy with republican federation. They imagined replacing a bad king with a better, rightful one. Procida's diplomacy, whatever its exact chronology, helped convince Peter that if he brought ships and banner to Sicily, he would not be treated as a foreign conqueror, but as a restorer of lawful kingship. Papal alignment with the Angevins had earlier blocked such ambitions. But once Palermo and then Messina had expelled garrisons and reinstated communal officers, the terrain of legitimacy shifted. In August 1282, Peter landed at Trapani to open acclamations. By carefully confirming privileges, upholding municipal statutes, and presenting his kingship as continuance rather than rupture, he gave the rising the sovereign figure it needed to withstand counterattack. Peter's intervention might still have failed had he not possessed or recruited first-rate naval leadership. The indispensable military figure here is Admiral Roger of Lauria, a commander whose serial victories decided the war's shape. Lauria understood that Angevin's strength lay in its ability to ferry armies from the Calabrian mainland and to sustain sieges with seaborne supply. He turned that strength into a liability by threatening and smashing convoys, forcing engagements on his terms, and using seamanship that maximized the value of experienced crews over raw numbers. Battles off Malta, and especially in the Gulf of Naples, where Lauria captured Charles's heir Charles of Salerno, were more than tactical triumphs. They were strategic punctures that deflated Angevin morale, complicated diplomacy, and bought indispensable time for institutional consolidation in Sicily. To put it bluntly, without Lauria's command of the sea, the Vespers might have gone the way of many medieval uprisings, heroic in memory, brief in fact. With him, the revolt became a war that the Angevins could not win at acceptable cost. Sicilian leadership on the ground mattered as much as kings and admirals. Local elites, urban jurats, notaries, guildheads, and parish clergy translated popular fury into governance. In Palermo and Messina, they reconstituted councils, organized watches, rationed grain, and issued safe conducts. Figures such as Alaimo da Lentini personify this layer of leadership. Men rooted enough in the island's social networks to mobilize quickly, literate enough to produce recognizable legal acts, and pragmatic enough to bargain with barons and sailors while keeping neighborhoods on side. Their success in the first week after the riot was decisive. By seizing armories, closing gates, and announcing oaths in the piazzas, they gave the movement shape before a royal army could impose its own. In towns where the revolt arrived by news rather than by spark, the same men convened councils to read Palermo's letters, disarm garrisons, and affirm customary law. A choreography that mattered because it presented the rising as law-defending rather than law-breaking. On the Angevin side beyond Charles, several leaders shaped the crown's response. Charles of Salerno, the king's son and designated heir, mustered fleets and tried to reassert control. His capture in 1284 deprived the Angevins of a rallying point and furnished the Aragonese with a bargaining chip that would figure in later truces. Angevin governors and captains who remained loyal worked to hold fortresses and coastal nodes, but they confronted a problem that strategy could not wholly solve: hostile logistics. Every landing required supplies from a countryside that refused them. Every siege demanded duration that the sea, now hostile, would not permit. The papal curia under Martin IV, a French pope, opted to double down, excommunicating Peter and endorsing the Aragonese crusade, an extraordinary move that tried to reframe a dynastic and communal conflict as a holy war against a Catholic king. The crusade drew Philip III of France into Catalonia and failed. Both Peter III and Philip III died in 1285. Curial authority, in Italian eyes, suffered from the spectacle of crusade instruments wielded as French statecraft. In the meantime, the Angevins were losing the more prosaic war of grain, pay, and port entry. Another layer of leadership sat outside Sicily, but played into the uprising's fortunes. The Byzantine court of Michael VIII Palaiologos, which had every reason to fear Angevin schemes for a Latin return to Constantinople, quietly financed and encouraged anti-Angevin combinations. The Genoese, commercial rivals to Pisa and often at odds with Angevin interests, tilted toward the Aragonese maritime cause. Even within Italy, factions in the communes, shifting Guelph and Ghibelline alignments, saw in the Sicilian War an opportunity to pin or loosen Angevin leverage. Leaders in these milieus did not command Sicilian crowds, but they opened gates abroad that Aragonese ships could sail through, and closed purses that Angevin envoys hoped to tap. On the Angevin side beyond Charles, several leaders shaped the crown's response. Charles of Salerno, the king's son and designated heir, mustered fleets and tried to reassert control. His capture in 1284 deprived the Angevins of a rallying point and furnished the Aragonese with a bargaining chip that would figure in later truces. Angevin governors and captains who remained loyal worked to hold fortresses and coastal nodes, but they confronted a problem that strategy could not wholly solve: hostile logistics. Every landing required supplies from a countryside that refused them. Every siege demanded duration that the sea, now hostile, would not permit. The papal curia under Martin IV, a French pope, opted to double down, excommunicating Peter and endorsing the Aragonese crusade, an extraordinary move that tried to reframe a dynastic and communal conflict as a holy war against a Catholic king. The crusade drew Philip III of France into Catalonia and failed. Both Peter III and Philip III died in 1285. Curial authority, in Italian eyes, suffered from the spectacle of crusade instruments wielded as French statecraft. In the meantime, the Angevins were losing the more prosaic war of grain, pay, and port entry. Another layer of leadership sat outside Sicily, but played into the uprising's fortunes. The Byzantine court of Michael VIII Palaiologos, which had every reason to fear Angevin schemes for a Latin return to Constantinople, quietly financed and encouraged anti-Angevin combinations. The Genoese, commercial rivals to Pisa and often at odds with Angevin interests, tilted toward the Aragonese maritime cause. Even within Italy, factions in the communes, shifting Guelph and Ghibelline alignments, saw in the Sicilian War an opportunity to pin or loosen Angevin leverage. Leaders in these milieus did not command Sicilian crowds, but they opened gates abroad that Aragonese ships could sail through, and closed purses that Angevin envoys hoped to tap. As the conflict matured from revolt to war, 1282 to 1302, Leadership on the Sicilian side evolved. Peter's son Frederick emerged as the island's long-term sovereign. Queen Constance provided dynastic continuity and a Hohenstaufen link that mattered for legitimacy. Municipal leaders settled into the mundane but essential work of re-establishing courts, markets, and tax regimes under the new crown. By the time negotiations produced the Peace of Caltabellotta, recognizing Frederick as king on the island and leaving the Kingdom of Naples to the Angevins, the Vespers had changed from a rising into a reconstituted polity. The treaty's terms were secured as much by the durability of Sicilian institutions as by the exhaustion of the combatants. Charles's successors could not pay the cost of reconquest. Aragon's rulers could not afford endless campaigning. Sicily's leaders could administer a state that foreign fleets found it hard to crack. What then, in leadership terms, made the Vespers succeed where many medieval uprisings failed? First, Charles I's policies inadvertently unified a heterogeneous island against him. Heavy taxation, foreign administrative cadres, and neglect of local forms alienated both elites and commoners. Second, insurgent leadership quickly institutionalized revolt. Councils, oaths, and proclamations converted a riot into a legal claim. We restore our law, which in turn made it possible to invite and accept a legitimate external sovereign without collapsing into intercommunal civil war. Third, the rebels secured naval leadership of the highest caliber in Lauria, whose victories transformed the theater. Without sea control, no amount of urban bravery could have survived Angevin counterlandings. Fourth, diplomatic leadership. Proceda's networking, Peter's claim, Constance's presence, reframed the struggle as a lawful transfer of kingship, blunting papal condemnation in local consciences. Finally, Angevin leadership overreached ideologically. By wrapping state aims in crusade language against a Catholic king, and by leaning on a papacy perceived as partisan, it narrowed the path back to Sicilian hearts, even as it tried to widen its coercive options. This is not to reduce the Vespers to a handful of great men and a single bad one. Crowd leaders in Palermo's parishes, women who carried water and news in Messina, guild elders who turned chests of tools into chests of arms, notaries who made law legible at speed. These actors deserve the word leadership too. But the uprising's trajectory was set where structure meets choice. Charles chose an extractive, centralized, and foreign-staffed regime to finance grand designs. Procida chose to broker a coalition that might shelter a popular explosion. Peter chose to stake ships, soldiers, and dynastic honor on a claim that matched Sicilian political culture. Laurier chose, and taught his men, to fight a war at sea that the Angevins could not match. Those choices, in aggregate, produced a settlement that redrew the map. A dual south, Sicily under Aragonese rule, and Naples under the Angevins, whose political and cultural consequences would ripple into the late Middle Ages and beyond. In the end, leadership on both sides was decisive in different ways. Charles's leadership was decisive in provoking, by design more than by accident, the conditions under which a single street clash could become a revolution. Procida's and Peter's leadership was decisive in aligning that revolution with legitimacy and power sufficient to endure. Laurier's leadership was decisive in securing the physical environment, control of the sea, that made the political settlement possible. And Sicily's communal leadership was decisive in administering a new order once the banners changed.
The Vespers is thus not only a tale of rage, it is a case study in how governance style, dynastic law, diplomatic networking, and operational command interact. How a king's system can generate its own undoing. How a diplomat's circuits can turn local revolt into international realignment. How an admiral's seamanship can translate political will into strategic fact. And how city leaders can turn flames into institutions. The first explosions of violence in Palermo did not remain an urban episode. Sicily in the late 13th century was a densely networked island, its ports tied together by short coastal hops, its inland towns linked by ridge roads that muleteers and messengers knew as well as any soldier. Word of the uprising, carried by parish confraternities, guild messengers, coastal skiffs, and simple rumor, moved faster than royal directives could chase it. The story that spread was not only that a woman had been insulted at Vespers and that blood had been drawn. It was that Palermo's people had seized gates, disarmed garrisons, and reclaimed their communal offices. That mattered because it offered other cities a template. A riot is contagious only briefly. An actionable plan, ring the bells, gather by parish and craft, disarm the soldiers, swear the oath, restore the statutes, can travel for days. Within days, the movement reached Messina, Catania, and Trapani, and then inward to Corleone and other hill towns. Each city had its own rhythm and grievances, but they shared three operational choices. First, they erected makeshift militias from existing civic structures. Guild companies, neighborhood watches, confraternity processions repurposed as call-ups. Second, they targeted strategic nodes rather than symbols alone. Armories, gate towers, and customs houses whose capture immediately changed the balance of coercion. Third, they legalized their acts as quickly as possible by convening councils, issuing oaths of mutual defense, and drawing up letters to neighboring communes justifying their measures as a restoration of law and honor. In other words, the island did not simply revolt. It regoverned itself in embryo, using the tools that medieval cities kept for ordinary life, and redeploying them for emergency. The Angevin administration was caught between speed and distance. Its formal center of gravity had slid to Naples, where Charles I had built up fleets and chancery. Governors on the island were strong enough to collect taxes and police market squares, but not strong enough to reconquer cities that had locked their gates and called out the militia. Immediate countermoves, riders to friendly castles, messages to the mainland, and small probes from surviving garrisons, ran into the brute facts of a hostile population and closed harbors. In places where Angevin officers still held forts, they found provisioning suddenly precarious. Peasants refused to sell, carts vanished into side valleys, and water points were watched. An army can fight without love. It cannot fight without grain. Messina quickly emerged as the hinge on which the campaign would turn. Geographically, it guards the straits, a narrows only a few kilometers wide separating Sicily from Calabria, and thus controlled the most practical staging line for any Angevin reconquest. Professionally, Messina's sailors, pilots, and shipwrights gave the city a maritime competence that most inland towns lacked. Politically, its communal institutions were used to managing traffic between island and mainland, and could flip those skills to denial. Once Messina joined the revolt in the spring and early summer of 1282, it became obvious to both sides that the war's early decision would be made here. The Battle of Messina, really a protracted struggle in the summer and autumn of 1282, crystallized that reality. Charles I, operating out of Calabria, concentrated a substantial force with the aim of retaking the city quickly, thereby reopening the straits for sustained crossings and forcing the rest of Sicily to fold. Messina's response was not merely brave, it was methodical. The commune strengthened gatehouses, cleared fields of fire outside the walls, and rigged defensive obstacles on streets that ran from the landward gates to the heart of the city. On the waterfront, sailors stretched chains across approaches, prepared fire ships, and used intimate knowledge of currents to complicate Angevin landings. The city rationed grain and water, appointed watch captains by neighborhood, and, critically, coordinated with Palermo and Catania for supplies, couriers, and reinforcements. When Angevin assaults came, probing landings combined with pressure from the Calabrian shore, Messina's defenders used short counterattacks and disciplined withdrawals, rather than grand gestures. Women and children ferried stones, water, and bolts to the walls. Craftsmen turned workshops into repair depots. Parish bells served as alarms and rally signals. Harborside skirmishes were frequent and costly, but the strategic picture was plain. If Messina held, Charles would be forced into an attritional war he was ill-positioned to sustain, especially if the sea lanes turned hostile. The Angevin effort was determined. Charles had no illusions about the stakes. But the failure to retake Messina became, as contemporary observers sensed at once, a turning point. It proved three things simultaneously: that the islanders could organize beyond the fury of Palermo, that ports could be held against combined land-sea pressure, and that the Angevin timetable, a swift, punitive reconquest, was broken. The fight for Messina also revealed the logistics of revolt. Makeshift militias win a day or a week. They lose a campaign unless they can feed and coordinate themselves across distances. Sicily's solution was pragmatic. Communes formalized mutual aid pacts. Coastal boats carried bulk grain at night under protection of local skiffs, and hill towns posted lookouts to warn of Angevin columns trying to break through the coastal belt from inland approaches. The countryside mattered as much as the walls. Villagers knew which cisterns and springs an army would need, which tracks could carry mules, and which vineyards offered cover to approach a gate. In the Messina crisis, the interior did its part by denying food and guides to the royal forces, multiplying the effort Charles had to expend for every mile gained. Through the summer, news of Messina's resistance and Palermo's consolidation changed the political atmosphere. Towns that had hesitated, worried that their uprising would be isolated and crushed, now saw that the island could hold out if it found a sovereign willing to claim and defend it. Here, the diplomatic groundwork that anti-Angevin activists had laid, often credited in the sources to John of Procida and like-minded exiles, paid off. Procida's travels among Aragon, the Byzantine court of Michael VIII Palaeologos, and Italian allies helped persuade Peter III of Aragon that the uprising was not a flash in the pan, but a transferable allegiance waiting for a legitimate claimant. Sicilians were not proclaiming anarchy. They were saying emphatically, "Not this king." That distinction mattered profoundly in medieval political culture, where the language of right, hereditary claim, confirmation of privileges, guardianship of law, could turn popular force into a recognized regime. Peter's landing in Sicily in late August 1282, traditionally at Trapani on the western coast, changed the war's geometry. He came not as a condottiere renting out soldiers, but as a king with a dynastic title via his wife Constance, Manfred's daughter and heir to Hohenstaufen claims. Peter understood the ritual imperatives. He allowed public acclamations, confirmed municipal charters, and signaled respect for the island's customary law. By presenting himself as Peter I of Sicily, he offered the rebels something they could not conjure alone: sovereignty with pedigree, and secured in return the political and logistical depth needed to resist Angevin pressure. Crucially, Peter brought a fleet. With Aragonese sea power entering the theatre, the contest acquired a new center of gravity: control of the sea lanes that fed any Angevin attempt to sustain sieges from the mainland. The crown jewel among Peter's commanders was Admiral Roger of Loria, whose mastery of Mediterranean fighting, galley maneuver, boarding discipline, tactical timing, would decide the war's next phase. Loria did not attempt to meet every Angevin squadron head-on. Instead, he hunted convoys, ambushed detachments, and forced set-piece engagements only when the wind, current, and crew condition favored him. In 1283, off Malta, he bloodied Angevin naval arms. In 1284, in the Gulf of Naples, he won a decisive victory that included the capture of Charles of Salerno, the future Charles II, the Angevin heir. That single feat rippled through diplomacy. It deprived the Angevins of a rallying figure, gave Aragon a hostage of the highest grade, and put teeth into negotiations over truces and exchanges. Meanwhile, on Sicilian soil, the makeshift militias of Spring had matured into civic forces working with royal officers. Cities kept watch lists, grain accounts, and munition inventories. Coastal towers traded smoke and fire signals. Couriers carried sealed letters under new royal seals. The experiment in emergency self-rule became a monarchy's local skeleton. Where Angevin outposts still held, fortresses with provisioned cisterns, stubborn inland keeps, they found themselves isolated and gradually starved. The rebels did not have to storm everything at once. They had to deny resupply, a function Loria's squadrons made easier by keeping the sea hostile to Angevin logistics. In Catania and Trapani, as in Messina, the pattern repeated in miniature. Initial street fighting gave way to gate control and then to institutionalization. Notaries who had drafted guild bylaws a year earlier now drafted proclamations. Priests who had arranged processions for feast days now blessed oaths of mutual defense. Jurats who had balanced budgets now rationed flour and set maximum prices to prevent profiteering. These are not romantic details. They are the mechanics by which a revolt survives the second month. An angry crowd can break a garrison. Only organized provisioning can keep a city from turning on itself. The Angevin counter-strategy was straightforward in theory. Re-establish a secure bridgehead. Build overlapping lines of land and sea supply. Pick off cities one by one, and count on papal pressure to delegitimize Aragon's intervention. In practice, each component faltered. Without Messina, the bridgehead never gelled. With Loria active,
sea supply kept failing at the margins, and papal measures, especially under Martin IV, who excommunicated Peter III and promoted the Aragonese Crusade, backfired in Italian opinion by making spiritual weapons look like French statecraft. Worse, Charles's very strengths, the ability to marshal large armies, turned into liabilities once feeding those armies depended on hostile shores and contested waters. Every column that crossed from Calabria consumed grain and coin that Naples could ill afford to bleed at length. By 1283–84, the strategic tide had plainly turned. Lauria's naval interdictions forced Angevin garrisons into economy of force. The capture of Charles of Salerno crippled Angevin diplomacy, and Sicilian communes, buoyed by Aragonese recognition and routine, settled into the patience that siege warfare requires. Inland, baronial strongholds that had hesitated in 1282 increasingly declared for Peter, either out of conviction or out of calculation that Angevin reconquest was receding. On the mainland, the Aragonese crusade drew French attention northwest into Catalonia, further diluting the resources available for a push back into Sicily. Both Peter III and Philip III died in 1285, a sign that the conflict had reached the limits of a single generation's energies. But the structure of advantage remained with Sicily. Island unity under a recognized king, sea control, and communal institutions doing the daily work of government. By 1285, it is broadly correct to say the Angevins had been driven from most of the island, holding at most a few isolated positions incapable of strategic initiative. The coronation of Peter as Peter I of Sicily, his kingship affirmed in 1282, then sustained by practice and ritual, marked not just a military success, but a constitutional outcome. The rebels had achieved what few medieval uprisings manage: replacement rather than mere resistance. The kingdom that emerged was not a commune republic, but a monarchy that absorbed communal energies and baronial power into its framework. The ensuing years would still see hard war, especially at sea and in the diplomacy of hostages and marriages. The ultimate political settlement, the Peace of Caltabellota, would formalize a dual South, Sicily under the Aragonese line, and the mainland Kingdom of Naples under the Angevins. Yet the decisive shift occurred in 1282–85, when the island learned that it could hold its ports, feed its cities, and call a king of its choosing. Two analytical threads tie these events together. The first is institutional elasticity. Sicily's communes did not have to invent governance under fire. They repurposed existing organs, councils, confraternities, guilds, parish networks, to fight, feed, and legislate. The speed with which Palermo, then Messina, then Catania and Trapani moved from riot to rules is the surest index that the revolt had depth. The second is maritime leverage. The Angevin state's strength on land could not compensate for the loss of the sea once Lauria made crossings costly and uncertain. In pre-modern war, especially on islands, logistics is strategy. Sicily's rebels understood that denying harbors and slowing convoys would do as much as pikes and stones at the gate. Finally, the psychology of success matters. The failure to retake Messina in 1282 did more than deny Charles a port. It convinced Sicilians that their stand was not suicidal. Confidence is a resource. It stiffened the spines of towns wavering between fear of royal vengeance and hope for local dignity. It encouraged barons to accept the risk of open defiance. It gave Peter III reason to stake fleets and honor on the crossing. And it framed the narrative in terms favorable to the island. We can endure. By the time 1285 closed, that narrative had become a political fact. The Angevin administration had been surprised in the spring. By the middle of the decade, it was outmaneuvered at sea, outsupplied on land, and outlegitimated in the squares of Sicily's cities. What began as a clash at Vespers ended as a reconfiguration of the central Mediterranean, achieved not by miracle, but by the convergence of social networks, civic institutions, and a timely royal protector sailing under the right banner. The most immediate result of the 1282 uprising was the demolition of Angevin authority on the island and the installation of an Aragonese sovereign. Peter III of Aragon's arrival that summer, under a credible dynastic claim through his wife Constance, Manfred's daughter, converted a popular rising into a recognized monarchy. In medieval political grammar, that mattered more than any single battlefield success. Sicilians did not aspire to permanent statelessness. They sought a king who would protect custom, restrain exaction, and limit foreign intrusion. Peter's acclamation as Peter I of Sicily gave the movement what it lacked at its birth: sovereign legitimacy to replace, not merely resist, a crown. Still, the transition was not linear. Peter died in 1285. His sons, Alfonso III and James II, took up the Aragonese inheritance, and Sicily's kingship soon passed to Frederick, Constance's younger son, who would rule from 1296 and become the durable architect of the island monarchy recognized by the Peace of Caltabellotta. That treaty split the former Regno. The island kingdom, often styled Trinacria, under Frederick, and the mainland kingdom of Naples under the Angevins. In other words, the Vespers created a dual South, a political fact that lasted for centuries and profoundly reshaped Italian and Mediterranean geopolitics. The papacy's alignment with the Angevins complicated the new order. Excommunications and overlapping peacemaking efforts produced a legal fog that Frederick and the island elites had to navigate. But fabric, not parchment, held. Sicily's communal institutions, Frederick's own administrative stamina, and Aragonese Catalan sea power together made the new monarchy operational, even while diplomacy lagged.
The Sicilian Vespers endures as one of those rare medieval events that was at once intensely local and unmistakably continental. A revolt touched off by a single confrontation in Palermo, yet shaped by structural forces that stretched from the papal curia to the Catalan littoral, from Neapolitan shipyards to Byzantine diplomacy. To call it dramatic is to state the obvious. More important is to see how that drama condensed years of fiscal pressure, administrative displacement, and everyday humiliation into an action that could reconfigure institutions and redraw maps. The spark, an altercation at evening prayers on Easter Monday, 1282, matters precisely because of the tinder it ignited.
accumulated resentments toward foreign officials and soldiers, the felt erosion of customary rights, and the perception that Sicily had been reduced to a revenue reservoir for external grand strategy. When Palermo's bells rang and the garrison fell, the island did not simply explode, it reorganized. That distinction explains why the Vespers reshaped Sicilian history and left a durable imprint on the European order. At the core of the uprising's meaning is the question of agency. Medieval crowds often riot. They rarely refound polities. The Vespers shows ordinary townspeople, guilds, parish confraternities, and segments of the peasantry acting in concert with municipal elites and parts of the baronage to turn outrage into governance. The first days after the Palermo spark were decisive. Arms were seized and gates secured. But so too were councils convened, oaths sworn, prices set, grain rationed, and letters dispatched to neighboring communes. That choreography, part habit, part invention, converted violence into a claim of legitimate restoration. Not anarchy, but the defense of law and honor against foreign usurpation. By casting their movement in the language of custom and right, Sicilians made room for a new sovereign to be invited, without disowning monarchy itself. In that way, popular action and constitutional reasoning worked together, rather than at cross purposes. The uprising also demonstrates how material hardship, social alienation, and cultural pride converge to produce revolutionary conditions. Taxes and requisitions bite in any age, but in late 13th century Sicily, they were collected by unfamiliar officials speaking a different tongue, enforcing procedures that discounted municipal statutes and local usages refined over generations. Billeted soldiers were the daily face of this order. Queue jumpers, rough hands at checkpoints, swagger in taverns, petty slights that became political when backed by royal warrant. Economic constraints were therefore read through a social lens. Extraction felt not merely excessive, but foreign. The erosion of autonomy not merely inconvenient, but dishonoring. Cultural pride, rooted in the island's Norman Hohenstaufen past, its multilingual legal culture, and its self-image as a crossroads that deserved respect, supplied the idiom in which to name the injury and demand redress. The Vespers rose from this fusion. The purse was light, the law felt distant. The face at the door did not belong. Yet the same event also reminds us to resist romantic simplifications. The Vespers was not a pure people versus tyrant morality play. It succeeded because it assembled coalition. Urban notables who could draft and register acts. Guild captains who could muster men and maintain order. Parish clergy who could bless the breach as a defense of peace rather than a profanation. Barons who could furnish cavalry and stone. Sailors who could convert coves and currents into defenses. And, crucially, external allies who could translate local victory into strategic security. The arrival of Peter III of Aragon in the late summer of 1282 supplied the indispensable ingredients that popular valor alone cannot maintain. A dynastic claim legible to medieval consciences, and a fleet with professional commanders like Roger of Loria, able to cut Angevin logistics and set the tempo at sea. Without that overlay of legitimacy and sea power, Messina might have fallen, the straits reopened, and the revolt penned back into a single, bloody episode. With it, the uprising acquired the durability to withstand sieges, outlast campaigns, and force a diplomatic settlement that acknowledged what the island had already made real. Those strategic mechanics, so often obscured when the Vespers is narrated as a single night of vengeance, explain how a local uprising rebalanced the Mediterranean. Angevin power, invited by popes to uproot the Hohenstaufen, had grown into a project to dominate the Central Sea, pressure the Balkans, and even threaten the restored Byzantine capital. Sicily was the keystone. Shipyards fueled by island revenues, ports leveraged for staging, and a bureaucracy shuttling decisions through Naples. By prizing the keystone loose, the Vespers fractured the arch. The consequence was not simply the end of Angevin rule on the island. It was the collapse of a wider imperial geometry. Aragon's rise as a central Mediterranean power, Genoa's leverage over maritime lanes, and Byzantium's reprieve from Western Crusader designs are all, directly or indirectly, features of the landscape altered by 1282. Internally, the shift from Angevin extraction to Aragonese rule did not abolish conflict, but it recalibrated governance. The new kingship, first under Peter's shadow, then under Frederick III of Sicily, did not promise tax-free utopia. It restored forms. Municipal statutes were confirmed. Courts that knew local usages regained space. Parliaments, the parlamento of clergy, baronage, and communities, were convened to bargain subsidies and register privileges. Billeting rules were regularized and, when possible, compensated. The point was not to weaken monarchy into paralysis. It was to re-embed royal action within negotiated channels islanders recognized as their own. That legal procedural shift mattered as much as immediate relief, because it replaced fear and rumor with predictability. The thin but vital line between felt oppression and tolerable burden. Economic consequences followed the same arc. Disruption, then reorientation. War always damages trade. 1282 to 85 was no exception. Ports endured blockades and feints. Inland markets tightened under requisition. Prices jumped. But as sea control tilted toward Aragon, and customs regimes were retuned to Catalan-Valencian circuits, Sicily found both new outlets and revived confidence. Grain remained the anchor export. Salt, fish, wine, and oil moved more securely under convoy and clearer dues. The difference from late Angevin practice lay less in total tax take than in the method of taking. Less farmed extraction that rewarded squeeze. More negotiated levies that traded cash for privilege confirmations. And more visible return in the form of defended harbors and dependable weights and measures. Recovery was uneven. Ecologies and local fortunes differ. But over time, the island's economy ceased to feel like fuel for someone else's engine. If the Vespers is an emblem of collective action, it is because Sicilians not only rose together, they remembered together. Memory is not an afterthought. It shapes institutions and future choices. Chroniclers framed the spark in terms of violated honor and communal peace. Notaries copied confirmations that stitched the uprising's aims into parchment. Liturgical life marked deliverances at local altars. Royal ceremonial reenacted public oaths. Through these repeated acts, 1282 became more than an episode. It became a charter. The story taught that community is not passive, that custom is not mere nostalgia, that kingship is acceptable if it bargains, and intolerable if it tramples. In that sense, the Vespers functioned as a pre-modern version of what we would now call civic education, a shared lesson about limits, rights, and reciprocal duty. None of this requires us to deny costs or complications. The Aragonese Sicilian monarchy still had to fund defense. Papal censure lingered at intervals. Baronial rivalries and urban jealousy did not vanish. Diplomacy occasionally threatened to unwind the settlement. Treaties like Anagni and ultimately Celta show how hard it was to transform battlefield facts into stable law. Yet the basic achievement persisted because it was flexible. A crown that negotiated, institutions that remembered, ports that functioned, and communities that knew how to supply themselves in lean moments. The Angevin dream of reconquest withered into episodic raids. Naples and Sicily hardened into separate kingdoms, each developing distinct legal and political cultures. The dual South is itself a testament to the Vespers' long reach. As for Europe, the revolt's resonance extends beyond war and treaties. It posed a problem to princely governance that remains recognizable. Capacity without legitimacy is brittle. The Angevins had ships, soldiers, and a papal warrant. They lacked local consent, and their style of rule broadcast that lack daily. The Vespers stands, therefore, as a caution against the belief that administrative uniformity and fiscal efficiency can substitute for respectful incorporation of local practice. Conversely, it illustrates the power of legality and ritual to channel force. Oaths, councils, and confirmations were not window dressing. They were the grammar by which Sicilians translated anger into authority. When modern readers admire the crowd's bravery, they should also attend to the notaries' clerks and parish sacristans, the quiet artisans of legitimacy, without whom bravery would have burned out. Cultural afterlives have magnified the symbolic weight of 1282, sometimes smoothing complexities into slogans of freedom. Yet even the romanticized versions capture a truth. The Vespers feels exemplary because it was both effective and bounded. It was effective in that it toppled a regime, induced great power realignment, and secured legal acknowledgement of a new order. It was bounded in that it sought a king, asserted continuity with established law, and avoided turning the island into a laboratory of utopian schemes. That combination, transformative aims inside conservative forms, speaks to a broad human intuition about sustainable change. People will fight more tenaciously to recover what they believe is theirs than to invent what they cannot name. The revolt's lessons are not a template. Historical conditions are stubbornly specific. Sicily's success drew on island geography, maritime skill, and a fortunate alignment of external interests, advantages not every oppressed community enjoys. But certain mechanisms recur. Collective action scales when it plugs into existing networks, guilds, parishes, municipal councils, rather than trying to conjure organization from nothing. It lasts when it institutionalizes quickly, rules for food, watches, and justice, so that supporters experience order, not chaos. It resists better when it secures allies who add capabilities locals lack, ships, legal claims, diplomatic channels. And it governs well only when it remembers why it rose. To embed authority within forms that people recognize as their own. Measured by these criteria, the Sicilian Vespers is not just inspiring, it is instructive. Ultimately, to say that the Vespers is a story of resilience, courage, and the pursuit of autonomy is to note both the moral and the practical achievement. Resilience was visible in Messina's walls and in the coastal chains stretched across its harbor. Courage in the first blows at Palermo, and the women ferrying water and stone to the ramparts. Autonomy in the charters reread and the parliaments reconvened. But autonomy was not isolation. It was a re-chosen interdependence, this time with a crown that spoke a language legible to Sicilians, and with maritime partners who respected the island's interests. The uprising's deeper promise for posterity is not that collective action can always win against injustice, but that when it does, it wins best by coupling righteous anger to institutional intelligence. That is why the Sicilian Vespers still resonates as a symbol of hope and defiance. It reminds us that injustice accumulates in habits as well as in edicts, that dignity is guarded in small rituals as well as in grand battles, that sovereignty without listening is a form of blindness, and that communities, when pressed, can rediscover the tools of self-rule buried in their ordinary life. The bells of 1282 did more than call a city to arms. They called an island to remember itself, its law, its honor, its capacity to decide. The echo carried far beyond Sicily, warning empires about the cost of governing against the grain, and encouraging peoples about the possibilities of acting in concert. In that double echo, warning and encouragement, the Vespers has earned its place not only in Sicilian memory, but in the broader European imagination, as a touchstone for how collective action, grounded in custom and sharpened by necessity, can bend the course of history. Thanks for watching.